very happy to present. So what I'm going to present today is what it was my job market paper, and I would be extremely happy to receive comments on the framing per se, because it's something that I'm particularly looking forward to change for the next steps. Okay, so what I have in hand is a project where I look at how women change the timing of their marriage when an important share of the local marriage market leave the areas. Okay, so the first question that should come to our minds is, why is this important? So we know that marriage early in life is related to poor outcomes connected with education, labor market, but also health outcomes for themselves, but also for their children. And despite his huge cost, still in developing countries is widespread. And in particular, women in conflict-affected and disaster-prone countries can be particularly vulnerable. Why? Because a conflict and a disaster bring a decrease in the household financial capacity, and according with the UNHCR, these events have led to the relocation of almost 100 million individuals worldwide. Framing this paper on the literature, growing attention has been devoted to study the consequences and the determinants of early marriage. But yet, we know very little on what is the impact of large population outflows on the age of marriage for women. And one of the potential reasons of why we see this lack of research in this area is because it's hard to identify an exogenous variation in a population outflows that is not correlated to potential determinants of the marriage market. And this is the question that I tackle in this project. And how I do so, I use large earthquakes in Indonesia from 1994 to 2014, and I put together a novel georeference panel dataset. In particular, bringing some description about my dataset. I built a novel georeference panel dataset at the age level that allow me to first track women until they get married and after they get married for the first time. And on top of that, I'm able to identify how each household was affected by an earthquake and the intensity of this effect, okay, the intensity of exposure to each earthquake. And for the identifications, I use the data set that I briefly present, and I profit from the plausibly exogenous variation in the timing and location of each earthquake within Indonesian provinces, and I conduct two main analyses. First, I start by comparing women that were born the same year, that are the same age, and live in the same province, and I compare women that are exposed and not exposed to earthquakes in a simple difference in difference specification. And what I find is that earthquakes increase women's early marriage compared to those women that are not exposed to earthquakes. Second, what I do also in this project, I try to evaluate if differential marriage pattern exists between women that migrate due to an earthquake versus those that stay in the areas affected. And this is a challenging question, but how I try to tackle this question. First, I benefit from an additional feature of my dataset that allow me to follow individuals over time and across space, and I apply a simple approach, that is adding an interaction in my difference in difference specification if migrating due to an earthquake. And as a preview of my findings, I saw that the impacts are even stronger for those women that migrate due to this shock compared to those that stay in areas affected. But let me clarify, I'm not claiming here a causal effect. There are many potential threats, but what I do in the paper, given the richness of my data set, I try to control for the potential self-selection into migration by showing that the decision to migrate is driven by how each household was affected by an earthquake. But on top of that, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm comparing women that migrate due to an earthquake versus those that stay in areas affected. So many unobservables might exist, and I'm aware of the potential limitation. So what I do, I add a second contrafactual that I compare women to their sisters. And this second contrafactual bring potential controls. Think about family attributes, networking capital, residence characteristics of the place of birth, religion, culture, what is important, an important determinant for the marriage market. And what I think is one of the contributions of this paper is thinking and try to shed light on why do we see this strong heterogeneity. And I'm going to give you a short preview of the main 3 channels that I propose, and I will be happy to give you more details at the end of this presentation. So to do so, I'm going to use a conceptual framework that derives from the model that you can find it in the model, in the paper, sorry. So imagine a household in a developing country such as Indonesia experiencing an unexpected migration due to an unpredictable earthquake. So first, this migration induced by an earthquake exacerbates the poor economic outcomes already affected by an earthquake. And second, migrant households end up in a new destination in which they have no local networks to turn to. And marriage can become an important and a vital informal insurance. And I propose 3 potential informal insurance that migrant household can obtain from their daughter's marriage. So first, I would like to invite you to think about a transfer that happens around the marriage, that is the bride price. In particular, is a transfer from the groom to the bride. So this monetary transfer can alleviate the credit constraint. Second, connected with another characteristic or even custom or tradition that happened around marriage is the matrilocal tradition. So in that case, those ethnic groups that are engaged in matrilocal tradition, it means that a new member, that is the potential husband, joins the wife's household, and it increases the household labor return by the new contribution that the son-in-law brings to the house. And third, marriage can also facilitate their socio-economic integration at the new destination. Okay? And what I'm going to do at the end of this presentation, I'm going to provide with the policy implications that emerge from this finding, and I will present suggested evidence on one policy that could help to mitigate these effects. Okay? Do you have some questions before moving ahead? No? Okay, perfect. So what is going to be the roadmap of today's presentation? So it's going to be very basic. I'm going to give you some details about my setting. I will continue with the data and my empirical strategy. I will show you a couple of main results. Then we will discuss together the mechanisms, and I will end up with the policy implications and the conclusions of this paper. Okay? So connected with the setting, I mentioned in the introduction that what I do in this paper is I use Indonesian marriage market, or I look at the Indonesian marriage market, and I use earthquakes to try to answer my research question. So let me give you some information about the Indonesian marriage market. So first, the average age of marriage for women is 22. But even if this is the average, it's still 1 out of 4 women marry before the age of 18. where the legal age of marriage for women is 16 and for men is 19. And here we can see the distribution in the figure number 1 of the age at marriage for women and for men. But what is interesting about the Indonesian marriage market and other countries in Southeast Asia and sub-Saharan countries in Africa is that there are many traditions that happened during the marriage, and there is a variation, there is a within country variation, and this variation is at the ethnic group level. Let me highlight a couple of traditions that are going to be important for the mechanism. So first, as I mentioned, is the payment from the groom to the bride. Because in Indonesia, there is no the transfer from the bride to the groom, that is the dowry. And 30% of the ethnic group in my sample are traditionally engaged in the bride price. Second, there is a variation in where the husband ends up after the marriage. The predominant tradition is that the wife joins the husband community, but however, that is called patrilocality. But however, there is a minority where it happens the opposite, that is the husband who joins the wife community. Okay? What else? Why large earthquakes are important to answer my research question? So first, Indonesia is one of the countries that is highly exposed to large earthquakes, given his location on the Ring of Fire. And this feature allowed me to pull together 21 earthquakes from 1994 to 2014. And how I define large earthquakes. So I start using the definition provided by Gigno and Menendez, that is an earthquake with at least a ground shaking of 7 in some of his location affected. Okay. But why I'm using earthquakes to look at population outflows is because within a given province, the timing and the location of the epicenter are unpredictable. I will show you some evidence that support this assumption. And third, earthquakes trigger the outmigration of thousands of individuals. That is the variation that I'm interested in to answer my research question. Great. So then, given the setting that I just presented, which are the data that I put together? So in the introduction, I mentioned that I put together a novel georeference panel dataset. And I combined 3 secondary surveys. First, the marriage data comes from the Indonesia Family Life Survey. This is a well-known longitudinal and individual level survey that goes from 1993 to 2014 and has been conducted for the last 21 years. And how I exploit this survey is because they provide data on the current and retrospective marriage behavior for each individual. So this information enabled me to track women until they get married and even after they get married. Using this information, I just built I reshaped my dataset and I built an ASAR model that goes from the age of 12 to the actual age at which women enter the marriage market for the first time. So think about a dataset that is a longitudinal dataset that goes age by age from the age of 12 until the age of when they get married. So if a woman and I get married at the age of 21, we will have individual observations from the age of 12 to the age of 21. But on top of having information on marriage, I have information and very granular information on their migration behavior. So I'm able to track individuals over time and across space. And this variation is at the year level and at the sub-district level. Having said that, let me clarify the administrative division of Indonesia. Indonesia is divided into different provinces, a province into different districts, and a district into different sub-districts. But what else? What is fascinating about this data set is that I know the GPS location of each household. On top of that, I have sociodemographic characteristics about them, but also about other members within the household. I know if they change one household when they get married or not, and even the payment that they receive for the marriage. But what is the main caveat in using changes between one household and other, and even the transfer at marriage is that could be endogenous not only to the earthquakes, but also to migration. So to circumvent this potential limitation, I use historical and ethnographic data on the marriage norms that comes from the ethnographic atlas. And this variation comes at the ethnic group level. So what I'm going to use to try to look at how, to look at the heterogeneity across ethnic groups, I'm going to use the historical and the traditional engagement in each norm, okay? And the third data set give me data on the earthquakes. And it comes from the United States Geological Survey. It's a geo-reference data set. And what is important is that given that I know the GPS location of each household, and I know the ground shaking or the intensity that each particular earthquake creates in each particular location, I'm able to spatially link the location of a household with the ground shaking created by an earthquake. Okay, so this is describe my data. And what about my empirical strategy? So to describe my empirical strategy, I would like to keep in mind the ASAR model of the structure of the dataset that I described in the previous slide. And I'm gonna present the intuition of my empirical strategy, and then I will continue on how I formalize this intuition. Okay. So what I do in this paper to try to answer my research question, that is, what is the impact of large population outflows on the age of marriage for women? I'm going to use a very, very simple example. So imagine an earthquake in 2010, as you can see on this picture. And what I'm going to combine is I'm going to combine two main sources of variation. First is the within province variation in where the epicenter of of an earthquake hit. Okay, so as we can see on this picture, we can see that there are some sub-districts that are affected by an earthquake, but on the other hand, we have other sub-districts that are not affected by the same earthquake. So this is the first variation. And the second variation is a within cohort and age variation if a woman was or not affected by an earthquake. So let me continue with the sample. I mentioned that there's an earthquake in 2010. So imagine that there are woman A and woman B. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to compare woman A, who was born in 1993, versus woman B, that was born also in 1993. But on top of that, I'm going to compare them when they are the same age, okay? And I'm going to replicate this simple exercise in a larger scale. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to compare women exposed to an earthquake versus women that are not exposed to an earthquake. And trying to think about my sample, I have 69% of my sample that are exposed to an earthquake versus only 31%. Okay, but how I formalize this exercise? So what I'm going to do, I am going to build, as I mentioned in the data slide, I'm going to build a panel dataset that is at the age level, and I'm going to regress if woman I that lives in subdistrict S and has a certain age or from cohort K and at age A, and I'm going to regress if is married. If is married is equal to 1 and 0 otherwise on my treatment. And what is the treatment definition? So the treatment definition is 1 from the moment of the earthquakes and remains 1 until the end. Then, as an alternative definition, I use different definitions of my treatment. I use different to capture certain problems that I might experience, and the results hold completely. And I will be very happy to discuss this part if you have some questions. On top of that, I include province fixed effect, year of birth fixed effect, age fixed effect, and urban fixed effect, because there is different probability of getting married if they live in a urban or a rural setting. I include individual level covariates that are defined before the earthquake, and I cluster my error term at the district level. Okay. But what do I find? So there are two main findings that I would like to share with you today. First is how an earthquake affects women in general, so all women. Okay, so this to say that how women that live in an earthquake affected areas change the timing of their marriage when an important share of the population migrates out of the market. And then I will continue with the heterogeneity between those that stay in the disaffected versus those that migrate within Indonesia. I will give you more details in a couple of minutes. Let me start with the first set of results. That is how earthquake or how a large population outflow affect the timing of women, the timing of marriage for women. And what we can see in this table is that earthquakes increase early women marriage, okay, or early marriage for women. So coming to the column number 3, what we can see is that women that are exposed to an earthquake from the age of 12 to the age of 22, they are 0.7 percentage points more likely to get married. Is this magnitude small? Is this magnitude large enough? So let me contextualize a little bit about the economic magnitude. This effect corresponds to an increase in the early marriage by 19%. But what about when I restrict the panel dimension of my dataset until the age of 18? So when women are exposed to an earthquake from the age of 12 until the age of 17, what we can see is that the results are very in line, but however, the magnitude of the effects are much more sizable. Let me move the screen over here. Why I said that is much more sizable? Because the effect correspond to a 44% increase in the probability of early marriage, what is quite sizable. But do you remember when I was discussing the setting that I said that the main advantage of using earthquakes is that we cannot predict in advance the location and the timing of the epicenter within a given province. And this is the main key identification assumption. Why? Because earthquakes will be uncorrelated to other determinants of the marriage market. So to try to generate some supporting evidence in favor of my key identifying assumption, I start showing that earthquakes are not concentrated in one particular region. what I do, I plot the longitude and the latitude, and we can see that there are earthquakes that happen all across Indonesia. So imagine that Indonesia is over here, then there is Java Island, and then the other islands, but it's not included in the Indonesia Family Life Survey. Some apps, sorry about. Yes. But what else? So what I'm doing in this paper is I'm estimating difference in difference specification. So we should not expect that women that are exposed and not exposed to an earthquake, they should evolve similarly in the absence of the treatment, right? That this is the well-known parallel trends. So I saw some evidence of the parallel trends, just estimating an event study, and what we can see is that there is no pre-trends before the trend, okay? But let me clarify, in this event study, I'm mechanically dropping women that are not exposed to an earthquake, so I'm just including women exposed to an earthquake, okay? I continue with additional robustness checks connected with the classic difference in difference estimator that are robust to the Chess-Martin-Dorfoys and an Abraham and other checks that I will be happy to discuss with you if you have some questions. But what about the second set of results? So I mentioned in the introduction that I'm not only interested in identifying the general effect of earthquakes on early marriage for women, but also I'm interested in disentangling the different effect between those that stay in the disaffected and those that stay and those that migrate to other locations within Indonesia. And how I do so? So I just add an interaction if migrating due to an earthquake. And importantly enough, I saw that the impacts are 72% stronger for women that migrate due to an earthquake versus those that stay in the disaffected. But can I claim that these effects are created by the migration? So to try to convince you about the connection between migration and this effect, I do my best to partially rule out the potential cell selection into migration. Do indeed these households migrate due to an earthquake, or there are other characteristics that are inducing them to migrate? So to try to generate some evidence, I first begin with a simple study, that is how earthquakes affect the migration probability. And I saw that earthquakes increase the probability of migrating by 49% compared to the baseline. And this probability is uncorrelated to gender, to ethnicity, to religion, and importantly, a potential marriage does not affect the probability of migrating. What do I mean by potential marriage? So in some Southeast Asian countries, there is a phenomenon that women or even households, they migrate in order to get married. And I have data about the marriage migration. So what I do is I regress the earthquakes treatment on the marriage migration, or even I calculate the gap year between the actual age at the moment of the earthquake versus 23. And I saw that this is not important in the decision to migrate. But what else? I know the location of each house, and I know how the same earthquake affected in different locations. So what I do, I especially link the location of household with the exposure to its household, and I saw that the probability of migrating increased with the exposure to an earthquake for its household. In particular, I saw that there is a strong correlation between probability of migrating and the ground shaking. And there is a negative correlation with the distance to the epicenter. That is another proxy of measuring the impact of an earthquake in a particular location. But what else? I know that I'm comparing exposed and not exposed to earthquakes women, so many unobservable. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I use an additional counterfactual that is using their sisters to try to compare them and try to make my counterfactual as comparable as possible with the treatment. What else? Can I expect that these results are driven by the characteristics of the new destination? So to try to evaluate and to try to rule out this, that this is true, I saw that this is a short distance migration. 69% of the women in my sample migrate within the same district, and 72% of them migrate within their traditional and historic ethnic homeland. This is something that I would like to look in detail in other projects, but it seems that the ethnicity component is an important factor in deciding where to move, okay? But then can we expect that the development at the new destination or the population composition is affecting my results? I collect data on economic development proxies, nightlight, population density. Then I use population composition in the local labor market using population census, and I saw that this is not affecting my results. But what is important is that the results even increased when the destination was also affected by an earthquake, which is quite intuitive. The sense that I'm affected by an earthquake, I exacerbate this effect with the migration, and on top of that, at the new destination, I also experience a new earthquake, okay? Connected with heterogeneity, I ran a bunch of placebo and robustness checks. I would be happy to discuss if you are interested, but let me continue with the mechanism. What I think is an important part of this paper, and I would be very grateful to receive your comments on this part. So at the beginning or in the introduction, I use a conceptual framework that derives from my model. And this is something I want to continue for this section. So do you remember that I was using the sample of a household that migrates unexpectedly after an earthquake that we should assume that is unpredictable? So first, they suffer a negative impact in the level of their income. And second, they end up in a new destination where the net worth decreases completely, or they are much more weaker than at the origin. And women's marriage can be an important coping strategy. And I presented 3 informal insurance. The first 2 were connected with marriage norms that are by price and multi-locality. But doing this, cultural norms are important for bringing ahead their marriage. And I test for this hypothesis using data from the ethnographic atlas from Murdoch that allow me to capture the within country variation in the traditional engagement in these 2 traditions. And I saw that indeed the probability of having higher effects of the earthquake on the early marriage for migrants even increase for those that are traditionally engaged in these 2 traditions. And what is striking is that the effect or the magnitude of the effect is 7 times higher for those women that are traditionally engaged in multi-locality or multi-local tradition. That, let me remind you, that is where the husband joins the white community. we could expect this effect. I mean, in the sense that women in Indonesia are not formally or are not as integrated in the labor market as men. So this is something that they expect. I'm gonna bring ahead my daughter's marriage in order to have an additional member that is the son-in-law, and it will help me to cope with the decrease in the income. And on top of the two traditions, the bride price and the fact of having a labor return, I mentioned about the social integration. Does marriage help the integration of a household at the new destination? And to try to test for this hypothesis, I used data from the Indonesia Family Life Survey, that is the actual participation in arisan and local activities. Arisan is an informal and financial group where women are the main members. But what we can see is that indeed there is a mitigation effect in the three variables or proxy of local engagement. And what we can see is that those households that are already integrated at the new destination, they mitigate the effect by 12%. And my interpretation is that the opposite will happen for those households that are poorly integrated at the new destination. Okay? What about the mechanisms for those that are how I'm doing with time? Good. Okay. So let me mention a little bit about this. So what about the mechanisms for those that stay in the areas affected? Let me tell you that it seems that the informal insurance are not important for left behind women. I test the hypothesis of how important bride price is important, what about matrilocal, what about the social integration, and it seems that they do not react to these informal coping strategies. Why? Because we cannot forget that an earthquake affected area, the entire market is credit constrained. So they cannot engage in this sort of financial insurance where their financial capacity has been massively affected. So then, which are the main channels that could explain the effects for the left behind women? And I saw that the population, an increase in the population outflow. So in other words, population that leave the areas affected after an earthquake, increase women's preferences for an early marriage. Why? Because they might prefer to get married now or earlier instead of risking and not finding a good match in the future. And a second potential mechanism is that an earthquake is a destruction in many sort of amenities, in particular schools. So a drop in schooling creates a substitution effect with an increase in the early marriage, in particular in marriage below the age of 18. So let me conclude. Which are the policy implications of this paper? Is indeed early marriage an effective coping strategy? And I saw that that is not the case. I mean, bringing ahead women's marriage comes together with an early fertility, a slow labor integration in the labor market, also a slow integration in the labor market, and even it affects negatively the matching of couples. There is an increase in the education gap and in the age gap. But do households cope with the shock when they bring ahead their daughter's marriage? And I saw that is not the case. There is no changes in consumption or expenditure pattern. So then, if early marriage is an economic incentive for household, how policy could address this economic incentive? I saw how I present evidence in the paper of how a monetary transfer can mitigate the effects. Particularly, I use unconditional cash transfer as a potential mitigation policy. And the mitigation effect is stronger for those households that are traditionally engaged in the bride price. What is an evidence that there is something going on connected with this informal insurance mechanism. Are these results applicable? Yes, I think they are applicable because it could affect not only countries that have been affected by natural disasters, but also for those that will be soon affected by these events. So let me conclude now. So what I saw you today. So the main question was, what is the impact of population outflows on the age of marriage? And the answer, do this affect? And yes, this affect. There is an increase in women's marriage below the age of 18 that correspond to a 44% increase. And the impacts are stronger for women that migrate due to an earthquake versus those that stay in the less affected. Okay? So thank you so much.